We can sit here in 2025, having watched murder in the 20th century on a mass scale by people like Mao Zedong, and be told on YouTube videos that China's real success was because of communism.
I would argue that governments have actually lifted the most people out of poverty. If you look historically, we look at China, for instance, had the most significant poverty reduction in all of human history. They pulled 800 million people out of poverty using state-owned enterprises and state centralized planning. They did work with the capitalist system, but they did it, most of it was done through state-funded infrastructure, education, and contributing to strong literacy programs, redistributing the wealth. I think that my other argument would be that there hasn't been an opportunity for alternative systems like socialism to pull enough people out of poverty. So we look at examples.
There hasn't been?
There hasn't been enough opportunities for them to succeed. And so when we say, I think that is partly because of the US, and I think because capitalist forces and global market insecurities have sabotaged these attempts to do socialism. And this is the problem that I have with so many capitalists is they can't exit their worldview and try to see a world where socialism could be in place because they don't understand the untapped potential of socialism. And I'm a democratic socialist. I think that we need to build forward towards that with reforms, and I think we need to work with the government. I don't think that we should abandon the state. I also don't think that we should give state elites the complete control over society. I do think that we should work with the state to instill these reforms and then eventually erode capitalism.
This is why I call all these people communists, because they're all communists. Democratic socialists. I think, you can, if you are in the socialist camp, democratic or otherwise, you will find most of them are ultimately just communists. They want to abolish private property and eliminate free enterprise. She said it herself. She's not alone. This is typical. Zoran Mamdani said, we want to ultimately seize the means of production, and the only difference is tactics. It's all strategy and tactics. The Fabians wanted to march through the institutions and go slowly. They thought that would be more effective to usher in communism, as opposed to Marx, who thought, well, workers will be immiserated, and then there will ultimately be a revolution of the proletariat, and the army of the proletariat will bring about the communist revolution. He was wrong about all of that because workers ended up doing better under free market societies. They weren't immiserated. And that's why we got wokeism, because, of course, when it turned out, say, in the 1950s and 60s, that the American working class was seeing their lives improve, rather than abandoning Marxism, people like Herbert Marcuse and the intersectionalists just said, well, we should just shift our target because obviously the revolution is all that really matters, and forget about this worker stuff. Let's just go after blacks and gays and disaffected college students. That was literally what they believed. We should just create a new proletariat of intersectional angry people. That's what they did. That's what they believed. That is this group sitting in the room. Their lives are great, relatively speaking, by human standards. Individually, there's a lot of struggle in that room. But I want to come back to China. She starts her thing off with China. And I think there is no better story to explode the philosophy of these people than an article about a very real event in China in 1978 that I'm going to read to you in part because it is so potent and so visceral that I don't see how you can't consider it the slam dunk end to this debate. And we'll put a link to this story in our show notes over at dadsavesamerica.com. It is called The Secret Document That Transformed China. In 1978, the farmers in a small Chinese village called Zhonggang, and I'm going to probably mispronounce most of this, I'm sorry, gathered in a mud hut to sign a secret contract. They thought it might get them executed. Instead, it wound up transforming China's economy in ways that are still reverberating today. And this was reported in 2013. And in the subsequent 12 years, Xi Jinping has been turning the state screws on the Chinese people, making it go in reverse, let's say, from its more free market outcomes. But let's keep going. The contract was so risky and such a big deal because it was created at the height of communism in China. Everyone worked on the village's collective farm. There was no personal property. Back then, even one straw belonged to the group, says Yang Jingchang, who was a farmer in Zhaogang in 1978. No one owned anything. Communism, the abolition of private property. At one meeting with Communist Party officials, a farmer asked, "What about the teeth in my head? Do I own those?" Answer, no. Your teeth belong to the collective. In theory, the government would take what the collective grew and would also distribute food to each family. There was no incentive to work hard, to go out into the fields early, to put in extra effort, Yang Jingchang says. Work hard, don't work hard, everyone gets the same, he says. So people don't want to work. In Zhaogang, there was never enough food, and the farmers often had to go to other villages to beg. Their children were going hungry. They were desperate. So in the winter of 1978, after another terrible harvest, they came up with an idea. Rather than farm as a collective, each family would get to farm its own plot of land. If a family grew a lot of food, that family could keep some of the harvest. This is an old idea, of course, but in communist China of 1978, it was so dangerous that the farmers had to gather in secret to discuss it. This group of farmers reinvented capitalism under the threat of death because they faced starvation if they didn't. So for anyone claiming that capitalism is imposed on people, as opposed to emerging naturally out of reality and human nature, I present this secret document in China that transformed the country and actually lifted 500 million people out of poverty. One evening, they snuck in one by one to a farmer's home. Like all of the houses in the village, it had dirt floors, mud walls, and a straw roof. No plumbing, no electricity. This is 1978, folks. Most people said, yes, we want to do it, says Yen Hongchang, another farmer who was there. But there were others who said, I don't think this will work. This is like high voltage wire. Back then, farmers had never seen electricity, but they'd heard about it. They knew if they touched it, you would die. Despite the risks, they decided they had to try this experiment and to write it down as a formal contract so everyone would be bound to it. By the light of an oil lamp, Yen Hongchang wrote out the contract. And this is right here. The central mediating institution of free enterprise, agreement, and trust. Capitalism is contract. It's voluntary agreement. And contracts are fundamentally about human trust. These people, under threat of horrendous murder by Mao's Chinese communist overlords, trusted each other to obey a black market creation of capitalism to save their families. The farmers agreed to divide up the land among the families. Each family agreed to turn over some of what they grew to the government and to the collective. And crucially, the farmers agreed that families that grew enough food would get to keep some for themselves. The contract also recognized the risks the farmers were taking. If any of the farmers were sent to prison or executed, it said, the others in the group would care for their children until age 18. Here is another exhibit of the emergent human nature of a free enterprise system: voluntary civil society and support. So right here, you not only have the invention of capitalism under Maoist China, you also have the invention of private social insurance by the group, by contract, with specificity, not some vague claim about the common good, but a specific promise to specific people on specific terms. And that's the difference between what these people and all the clowns in academia think they're saying when they say we have a social contract. This was an actual contract, and it worked. The farmers tried to keep the contract secret. Yang Hongchang hid it inside a piece of bamboo in the roof of his house, but when they returned to the fields, everything was different. Before the contract, the farmers would drag themselves into the field only when the village whistle blew, marking the start of the workday. After the contract, the families went out before dawn. We all secretly competed, says Yen Jingchang. Everyone wanted to produce more than the next person. It was the same land, the same tools, and the same people. In other words, it was the same means of production. Yet just by changing the economic rules from communism to capitalism, by saying you get to keep some of what you grow, everything changed. At the end of the season, they had an enormous harvest. More, Yen Hongchang says, than in the previous 5 years combined. That huge harvest gave them away. Local officials figured out that the farmers had divided up the land, and the word of what had happened in Zhaogang made its way to the Communist Party chain of command. And this is where, if this had happened only a few years prior, they all would have been put against the wall and shot. At one point, Yen Hongchang was hauled into the local Communist Party office. The officials swore at him, treated him like he was on death row. But fortunately for Mr. Yen and the other farmers at this moment in history, there were powerful people in the Communist Party who wanted to change China's economy. Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader who would go on to create China's modern economy, was just coming to power. So instead of executing the Zhaogang farmers, the Chinese leaders ultimately decided to hold them up as a model. Now, this young woman thinks that this is the government lifting people out of poverty. This is the government taking its boot off the neck of the public. This is the government receding. It is not credit to the government and its boot that when it steps away and things get better. That is not the government made China rich. That is the government enslaved the Chinese people. And then when it finally started to back off, human nature, creativity, and capitalism unleashed actual prosperity. Within a few years, farms all over China adopted the principles in that secret document. People could own what they grew. The government launched other economic reforms, and China's economy started to grow like crazy. Since 1978, something like 500 million people have risen out of poverty in China. And again, that number is much higher as of today. And even though China has backslid in recent years under Xi Jinping, the fact remains that this transformation was a miracle brought about by the human reasserting our natural capabilities under free enterprise, under private property, the rule of law, and contract. That's capitalism. That's what lifted billions of people out of poverty. You can go a lot deeper on this. There's a book by economist Ronald Coase and Ning Wang called How China Became Capitalist that highlights this and how actually it was overwhelmingly a bottom-up phenomenon like this single private meeting in this small farm village. And this is the ultimate refutation of all these people and this growing group of young people who are deciding to re-engage humanity's most monstrous, demonic, murderous idea. If you like this clip, you should check out the full video and all the other great content we've got at Dad Saves America. So be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our new stuff as it drops each week.